Mason Briggs kicked the no trespassing sign flat into the dirt, then spat on it and laughed. Whoever owns this rock is already dead and don't know it yet. His men cut the fence wire, dumped a barrel of poison into the clear mountain stream, and watched two deer stagger and fall. Briggs grinned wider. He thought the woman living up there was alone, helpless, forgotten. He thought wrong. Nearly a mile above him, a scope settled gently on the back of his skull, and a quiet voice whispered, "You shouldn't have touched the water." Before we go any further, if stories about people who push the wrong person too far are the kind that keep you watching, subscribe to the channel right now and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one turns in ways you will not see coming. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from tonight so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Charlotte Hayes did not move when the men below started shooting at shadows. She had been still for 3 hours, and stillness was the only thing the Navy had ever truly taught her that she still believed in. Everything else, the speeches, the medals, the promises, all of it had cracked apart somewhere over the last 6 years. But stillness had stayed. Stillness had become her religion. Through the scope, she counted them again. 6 men, 2 trucks, 1 leader who did most of the talking and none of the working, which told her everything she needed to know about who gave the orders. The leader wore a tan jacket and carried himself like a man who had never once been told no. She watched him crush a wildflower under his boot for no reason at all, and something cold and familiar settled into her chest. "You came up here to take from people who can't fight back," she said softly to no one. "Let's see how that goes." She keyed the radio clipped to her collar, though there was no one on the other end. It was a habit. Old teams had old habits. 2 on the leader's flank, streams poisoned, wildlife down. They're searching the South Ridge. Static answered her, just static. Charlie lowered her eye back to the glass and exhaled slow. Down below, Mason Briggs was enjoying himself. "I'm telling you," he said to the heavy man beside him, "government marked this whole range abandoned. Some lady bought the deed for nothing because nobody else wanted a mountain with no road. That's all that's between us and the payday." "And if she's home?" the heavy man asked. Briggs shrugged like the question bored him. "Then she has an accident. Mountains are dangerous, Pete. People fall all the time." Pete laughed because he was paid to laugh. The other 4 spread out across the slope, rifles up, boots crunching over ground that did not belong to them. Charlie watched the leader's mouth move and could not hear the words, but she did not need to. She had seen this exact shape of man in 3 different countries. The smile, the ease, the certainty that the world was a thing you simply reached out and took. She had spent her whole career hunting men like him, and then she had come home and discovered her own country was full of them, wearing suits instead of fatigues, and that nobody up the chain wanted them caught. That was the part that had broken her, not the war, the coming home. "Last warning you're going to get," she murmured, and her finger moved to the trigger guard. "And you'll never even know I gave it." She did not want to fear here. People who had never done it imagined that pulling a trigger got easier with practice, and the opposite was true. It got heavier. Every single one stayed with her, a small permanent weight, and she carried them around like stones in her pockets. She had promised herself, when she bought this mountain, with the last of her savings that she was done, that the stones would stop. But then she had found what was buried beneath the mountain, and after that the promise no longer belonged to her. Briggs raised his hand and pointed toward the old fence line near the tree break. "Pete, take 3 men, check that ridge. There's a structure marked on the survey somewhere around here. Concrete. Old. That's our entry point." Charlie's breath caught. He knew. He knew about the structure. This was not a hunting party that had wandered too far. These men had a survey. They had coordinates. They had been sent. Everything she had feared for 8 months was no longer fear. It was standing on her mountain, pointing at the one door she had sworn no living soul would ever open. "They came for it," she whispered. "They actually came for it." For one long moment, Charlie closed her eyes. Behind them, she saw faces. A combat medic named Ryan who used to hum old country songs while he stitched men back together. A demolitions kid named Lucas who laughed at danger because laughing was the only thing that kept his hands steady. A quiet recon man named Noah who could disappear in an open field. and a colonel, an old hard Marine named Harper, who had once stood in front of a room full of officers and said women had no business in special operations, and had said it while looking right at her. She had not spoken to any of them in years. She had told herself she did not need them. She had told herself a lot of things. Charlie opened her eyes. Pete and three men were almost at the tree break, almost at the door. "I'm sorry," she said. She was not sure who she was apologizing to. Maybe to herself. Maybe to the woman she had hoped to become up here, the one who grew tomatoes and watched sunsets and never touched a rifle again. Then she fired. The first shot took Pete clean, and he dropped before the sound even reached the others. The mountain swallowed the crack and threw it back from four directions at once, so the men below could not tell where it came from. They scattered, screaming, firing wildly, at trees, at rocks, and at nothing. Charlie was already shifting her aim, calm, patient, the way water is patient. The second man went down a heartbeat later. "Where is she?" Briggs was shrieking now, all the ease gone from his voice. "Where is she?" She let them panic. Panic was a weapon too, and she had learned long ago to let the enemy hand it to her for free. Two men were running for the trucks. She let them run. The others dragged Briggs behind a boulder, and Charlie eased off the trigger and watched. "You feel that," she said quietly to the glass. "That's the mountain noticing you. That's what it feels like right before it decides you don't belong." Below, Briggs pressed his back to the rock and pulled a phone from his jacket with a shaking hand. Charlie watched his lips move and read three words off them as clearly as if they had been printed on a page. "It's gone wrong." She lowered the rifle. She did not chase the survivors. She let them go. Because dead men told no stories, but terrified men told all of them, and she wanted whoever sent these people to hear exactly how badly it had failed. She wanted them afraid. Fear bought time, and Tano was the only thing she truly needed now. Charlie sat back against the cold stone and looked up at the wide, empty sky and let her hands stop shaking on their own schedule, which was the only schedule they kept anymore. "Two more," she whispered, and added them to the weight in her pockets. The sheriff came the next morning. Charlie heard the engine long before she saw it, a county truck grinding up the old logging trail that most people did not even know was there. She was sitting on her porch with coffee gone cold in her hands when Sheriff Daniel Carter stepped out, hat in hand, eyes already moving over everything the way a careful man's eyes do. "Ma'am," he said. "Sheriff." He stopped at the bottom of her steps. He was older, maybe 55, with the kind of weathered face that had seen too many bad mornings to be surprised by another one. "I've got two dead men down on the South Ridge and two more that came tearing into town last night, babbling about ghosts. You know anything about that?" Charlie took a slow sip of her cold coffee. "Yes." Carter blinked. He had clearly expected denial deflection, a lawyer anything but that single flat word. "You want to maybe think before you keep talking to me?" "No," she said. "I shot them. Both of them. From up there." She nodded toward the high ridge a mile distant, the one no ordinary person would even consider a firing position. "Two shots. You'll find the brass if you climb up, though I doubt you'll want to." Carter stared at the ridge, then back at her, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation. "That's nearly a mile. Closer to 1,500 yards on the second one. Nobody makes that shot." Charlie finally looked at him full on, and there was no boast in her face, no pride, only a tiredness so deep it had its own gravity. "I do." The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Then he climbed her steps, slowly uninvited, and sat down on the bench across from her, like a man whose legs had simply decided for him. "Lady, I came up here ready to arrest you. You understand that two bodies. That's not a thing I can just drive away from." "I know." "Then why aren't you running? Why aren't you lying? Why are you sitting here handing me a confession like it's the morning paper?" Charlie set the coffee down. When she spoke, her voice was steady and low, and it carried a weight that made the older man lean in without meaning to. Because they weren't hunting sheriff. They didn't come up here to poach a deer or run cattle. They came for what's buried beneath my land. And the men who sent them are going to send more, and the next ones won't be drunks with rifles. So no, I'm not running. There's nowhere on this earth far enough to run from what's underneath us. Carter sat very still. The morning wind moved across the porch. Somewhere down the slope, a bird that had survived the poisoned stream called out once and went quiet. "What's buried beneath your land?" he asked finally. And Charlie almost smiled because it was the first time in 8 long months that another living soul had asked her that question, and for one strange moment, she did not feel quite so alone. "You really want to know," she said. "Once you know, you can't unknow it. And the kind of men who care about this don't draw a line between a sniper on a mountain and a small town sheriff who asked one too many questions. You'd be on the list same as me." Carter put his hat back on his head and squared it. "Son, I've been sheriff in this county for 26 years. I've buried friends. I've watched men I arrested walk free because somebody made a phone call. I know exactly what kind of list you're talking about." He met her eyes. "Tell me." Charlie studied him for a long moment, the way she studied everything, looking for the lie underneath the surface. She did not find one. "All right," she said, "but not out here." She stood and walked to her door and opened it, and then she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at the dead poison slope below where two men lay who had thought a mountain and a woman would be easy. "When I bought this place," she said quietly, "the realtor told me it had no history. Empty range, nobody ever lived here. That's why it was cheap." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Turns out it had more history than the whole county. They just made sure it wasn't written down anywhere a person could find it." She went inside. After a moment, Sheriff Carter followed her and the door closed behind them both. What she showed him in the next hour changed everything. She led him through her cabin, through a back room, down a flight of concrete stairs she had uncovered and rebuilt by hand to a steel door set into the living rock of the mountain itself. The door was old, the kind of Cold War engineering built to outlast nations, and stenciled across it in faded military paint were words that had been classified for 50 years. Carter stopped breathing for a second. "What is this?" "An installation," Charlie said. "Cold War. Built to survive things that thankfully never happened. The government walked away from it in the 80s and pretended it never existed. The land got marked abandoned. Eventually, it got sold off to whoever was foolish enough to buy a mountain." She placed her hand flat on the cold steel. "Me. And what's inside?" Charlie looked at him, and for the first time, the sheriff saw something behind the iron calm. Not fear, something heavier. The look of a person who had read something they could never give back. "Records," she said, "sealed archives. Decades of them. Names, dates, transfers, contracts, payments. An entire network of people who turned this country's defense into a private bank account. Contractors, intelligence men, politicians, executives. 50 years of evidence that somebody buried in a hole in Idaho and assumed would rot." She lowered her hand. "It didn't rot, and 8 months ago I found it." The sheriff leaned against the wall because he suddenly needed to. "If that's real," he said slowly, "if even a piece of that's real, then those men last night weren't thieves at all." "No," Charlie said. "They were cleanup, and the man who sent them already knows exactly what's down here. He's known for months. The only thing he didn't know was that the quiet woman who bought the mountain used to put bullets into men exactly like him for a living." Carter rubbed a hand down his face. "Why didn't you just turn it over? Take it to the FBI, the press, somebody?" Charlie's jaw tightened, and when she answered, the bitterness in her voice was old and worn smooth, like a stone carried for years. "Sheriff, who do you think buried it the first time? Who do you think marked this whole range abandoned and sold it for pennies so nobody would ever come looking? You think these names go in front of a judge and the system just works?" She shook her head slowly. "I tried trusting the system once, with something a lot smaller than this. It cost good people their lives, and the men responsible got promoted. I will not make that mistake twice. When this comes out, it comes out in a way they cannot bury, or it doesn't come out at all." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The mountain hummed around them, ancient and patient, holding its secret the way it had held it for half a century. Then Carter straightened. "What do you need?" Charlie blinked. It was not the response she had expected. "You heard me," he said. "I've spent 26 years writing tickets and pulling drunks out of ditches while bigger men got away with worse. I don't have many good years left, and I am damned if I'm going to spend them pretending I didn't see this door." He met her eyes. "So tell me, soldier, what do you need?" And something in Charlie's chest, something that had been clenched tight and cold for years, eased just slightly. "I need time," she said. "I can hold this mountain. I've done it once and I'll do it again. But I can't fight an army alone, and I can't build a case alone. The man who's coming, the one giving the orders, he doesn't want the evidence recovered. He wants it gone. And he wants everyone who's ever seen it gone too. She looked at the old steel door. That includes you now. I told you it would. I know, Carter said. I climbed up here anyway. A faint, real smile touched the corner of Charlie's mouth, the first one in a long time. Then we'd better get to work, she said. Far away, in an office where the windows looked out over a city of marble, in power, a man set down a phone after a conversation that had gone badly. He did not raise his voice. Men at his level never raise their voices. He simply looked out the window for a long moment, then pressed a button on his desk and spoke 4 quiet words that would set the rest of the story in motion. Send me the real ones. He did not know her name yet. He thought of her when he thought of her at all as a problem on a mountain, an obstacle to be removed. A woman who had gotten lucky against a crew of amateurs. He had spent his entire career being the most dangerous man in every room, and he could not imagine, even for a second, that somewhere in the high cold pines of Idaho there was a person he should genuinely be afraid of. He would learn. Back on the mountain as the sun climbed and the shadows shortened, Charlie Hayes stood on her porch and watched the sheriff's truck disappear down the logging trail, carrying with it the first promise of help she had accepted from anyone in 6 years. She had spent so long believing that strength meant carrying everything alone, that asking was weakness, that trust was just a slower way of getting hurt. She pulled out an old phone, the kind that could not be traced, and stared at it for a long time. Then she scrolled to a number she had memorized but never called. A combat medic who used to hum country songs. She did not know if he would even pick up. She did not know if he would forgive her for the silence. She did not know if any of them would come. But the men in the marble offices were sending the real ones now, and the quiet woman on the mountain understood with the cold clarity that had kept her alive across 3 wars that the next storm would not be stopped by 1 rifle and 1 tired sheriff. She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice she had not heard in years said, rough and disbelieving, "Charlie, is that really you?" And Charlie Hayes closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not alone on her mountain. "Ryan," she said quietly, "I need you to come home. All of you. It's wild and it's real, and I can't do this one by myself." There was a silence on the line, a long one, the kind of silence that holds years inside it. Then Ryan Mercer said the only thing she needed to hear. "Where do you need me?" Ryan Mercer came up the mountain 40 hours later in a truck that had seen better decades, and when he stepped out of it, he did not say hello. He just stood there looking at Charlie across the gravel, with his medical bag in one hand, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "You look terrible," he finally said. "You look old," Charlie answered. "I am old. You did this to me. You and that silence. 6 years, Charlie. 6 years and not 1 word, and then you call in the middle of the night sounding like the war never ended." She didn't apologize. He wouldn't have wanted her to. Instead, she walked down the steps and put her arms around him, and the big man stood stiff for a second before he wrapped 1 arm around her back and held on, and the medical bag dropped into the dirt between their feet. "It didn't end," she said into his shoulder. "That's the thing nobody tells you. It just goes quiet for a while and waits." He pulled back and held her at arm's length and studied her face the way a medic studies a patient, looking past the words for the truth underneath. "On the phone, you said it was real. You said it was bad. I want to hear all of it, and I want to hear it before the others get here, because if you brought me up this mountain to die for something stupid, I'm going to be very disappointed in both of us." "Come inside," Charlie said. "Then tell me if you think it's stupid." 20 minutes later, Ryan Mercer was sitting on the concrete stairs that led down to the steel door. His face pale, a folder open across his knees, and he was no longer making jokes. "This is real," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. "It's real." He turned a page, then another. His hands, which had been steady through 100 battlefields, were not entirely steady now. "These are names, Charlie. Real names. I recognize some of these. This one." He tapped the paper. "This man gave a speech at my unit's homecoming, shook my hand, told me I was a hero." His jaw worked. "And according to this, the same week he was shaking my hand, he was signing off on diverting equipment that got men in my own platoon killed." "Now you understand," Charlie said quietly. Ryan closed the folder. He sat there with it shut in his lap, staring at nothing. "How long have you been sitting on this alone?" 8 months. 8 months. He shook his head slowly. 8 months knowing this, and you didn't break. You didn't run. You didn't put a bullet in your own head, which honestly, looking at half these names, I'd understand if you'd been tempted. He looked up at her. Why'd you wait so long to call? And there it was, the question underneath all the other questions, and Charlie had known it was coming since the moment she dialed his number. Because I didn't think any of you would come, she said. After what happened. After I left the way I left. I figured you all had every right to hate me, and I figured asking for help was just one more way of putting people in front of a bullet that was meant for me. She looked at the steel door. I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things up here. Turns out a person can only carry so much before the weight stops making them strong and just starts making them alone. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and he put a hand on her shoulder and he squeezed once hard. You're not alone anymore, he said. Now show me the rest of this place and tell me everything, because if these people are coming, we don't have time for feelings. We can have feelings later, if we live. The second truck arrived at dusk. Lucas Grant climbed out grinning like a man arriving at a party, which was exactly how Charlie remembered him, because Lucas grinned at everything, and the more dangerous a thing was the wider he grinned, and she had once watched him laugh out loud while defusing a device that would have leveled a city block. Well, 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 he called out across the yard. The ghost lives. They told me you went up a mountain to disappear, and look at you. You went up a mountain and started a war instead. That's so much more your style. Lucas. Charlotte Hayes. In the flesh. Older. Meaner. I love it. He swept her up off her feet in a hug before she could stop him, spun her once and set her down. Ryan called me, said you found something that's gonna get us all killed. I said, finally a vacation. He clapped his hands together. So where's the good stuff? Where are the toys? You said over the phone. There's a whole Cold War bunker under this rock. Please tell me there's a whole Cold War bunker under this rock. There's a whole Cold War bunker under this rock, Charlie said. Lucas put a hand over his heart. I have waited my entire adult life to hear a woman say that to me. Even Ryan laughed at that, and for one brief moment, standing in the fading light on a mountain that men were coming to kill them, on the three of them felt almost like they had years ago before the world taught them what it really was. Then Charlie's expression sobered. There's something you both need to understand before the others get here, she said. I didn't call you up here to win a fight. I called you up here to survive long enough to do something that actually matters. The man who's coming, the one giving the orders, he's not Briggs. Briggs was the muscle, and Briggs failed, and now Briggs is a liability who's probably already dead. She let that land. The real one is a defense executive named Richard Caldwell, and Caldwell doesn't want to recover what's in that bunker. He wants to erase it, which means he wants to erase everyone who's seen it, which now includes the two of you. Lucas's grin didn't fade, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Caldwell, Richard Caldwell. I know that name. Everybody in our line of work knows that name. He's not a man, Charlie. He's an institution. He's the guy who decides which wars get fought and which contracts get signed and which inconvenient people retire early into a ditch. Then you understand why I waited 8 months to make a phone call, Charlie said. The grin finally went away. Lucas looked at the steel door, then at her, and for once in his life, he had nothing funny to say. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I understand. The third one came in the dark and nobody heard him arrive. That was the thing about Noah Bennett. Charlie was standing on the porch at nearly midnight, scanning the tree line out of pure habit, and she did not see him, did not hear an engine, did not catch a single sign until a low voice spoke from 6 feet to her right, where there had been nothing a moment before. Your perimeter's good, Noah said. I still walked right through it. Charlie didn't jump. She had learned long ago not to give him the satisfaction. You always did love to make an entrance by not making one. How long? He asked, stepping into the porch light, at last a lean, quiet man with watchful eyes. How long have you been up here playing Fortress by yourself? 8 months. Noah nodded slowly, taking that in. He looked out at the dark mountain, reading it the way other men read a newspaper. You picked good ground, he said. High, defensible. One real approach, a couple of bad ones. Whoever taught you to choose terrain taught you well. A pause. I think that was me. It was you, Charlie admitted. Then I have only myself to blame for how much trouble you're about to be. He almost smiled. Almost. Ryan filled me in on the drive up, the bunker, The names, Caldwell. He turned to face her fully. You know what you're asking, right? You're not asking us to win a gunfight. You're asking us to go to war with a man who owns half the people who'd be sent to investigate his crimes. There's no winning that with a rifle, Charlie. You know that better than anyone. I know, she said. That's exactly why I need all of you, and why I need more than guns. I need witnesses. I need a record. I need to build something so clean and so undeniable that even Caldwell can't bury it. And to do that, I need to survive the storm that's coming, and I cannot survive it alone. She looked at him. Will you stay? Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his pack. I was never going to leave, he said. I just wanted to hear you ask. That left one. They were gathered in the cabin near 2 in the morning. The four of them, maps spread across the table, the steel doors secret hanging over every word they spoke when the sound of a vehicle came grinding up the logging trail. Lucas's hand went to his sidearm. Noah was already at the window, gone still as stone. Expecting somebody? Ryan asked. No, Charlie said, and she lifted her rifle off the table. But it wasn't an attack. The truck stopped at the bottom of the steps. The engine died, and an old man climbed out slowly, the way a man climbs out when his knees have logged more miles than the truck has. He stood there in the dark, and even before the porch light caught his face, Charlie knew exactly who it was, and the rifle lowered in her hands, not from relief, but from sheer disbelief. No, she said softly. No way in hell. Colonel William Harper stepped into the light. He was older than she remembered, grayer, leaner, but he carried himself the same way he always had, like a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. And his eyes found hers across the dark yard and held them, and there was something in his face Charlie had never seen there before. Something that looked almost like shame. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Charlie set the rifle aside and walked to the top of the steps and looked down at the man who 15 years ago had stood in a room full of officers and said in front of all of them that women had no business in special operations, and had said it while looking right at her. You've got a lot of nerve, she said quietly, driving up my mountain in the middle of the night. I know, Harper said. You told a room full of men I'd get good soldiers killed. You said I didn't belong. You said it to my face. I know what I said. His voice was rough. I've known it every day since. I've watched your career from a distance for 15 years. Hayes watched you do things I told everyone couldn't be done, and every single time you did one of them, I heard my own voice in my head saying, you couldn't. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. I came up here because Ryan called me, and because when he told me what was happening, I realized I had a choice. I could keep being the man who was wrong about you 15 years ago, or I could finally be of some use. He looked up at her. I know you've got no reason to want me here, but I've got contacts, Hayes, federal ones, trusted ones, people who've spent their whole careers waiting for evidence like what Ryan says you've got. I'm too old to do much fighting, but I can open doors that the rest of you can't, and I came to offer that. That's all. Charlie looked down at him for a long, long moment. It would have been easy to send him away. Part of her wanted to the part that had carried his words like a wound for 15 years. But she had not survived 3 wars and 8 months alone on a mountain by letting old wounds make her decisions for her. The contacts, she said, they're real. They're clean, because if I let your people anywhere near this, and even one of them belongs to Caldwell, we're all dead, and so is the evidence, and so is the whole point. They're real, Harper said, and they're as clean as anyone left in this country is. I'd stake my life on it. You are staking your life on it, Charlie said. All of ours, too. I understand that. She held his eyes a moment longer. Then she stepped aside from the doorway, and it was the only invitation she was willing to give, but it was enough. Then come inside, Colonel, she said. We've got work to do and not much time to do it. Harper climbed the steps slowly, and as he passed her, he paused, and for just a second, the hard old soldier let something honest show through. For what it's worth, Hayes, he said quietly, I was wrong, about you, about all of it. I've waited 15 years to say that to your face. I know you were, oh yeah, Charlie said. Now get inside before you let the cold in. But there was no anger in it, and the old man heard that, and something in his shoulders eased as he stepped through the door. What came next was 3 days of work that did not stop. Charlie laid it all out for them around the table. Every drone she'd flown, every trail, camera she'd hidden, every thermal sensor she'd buried in the dirt over 8 long months. She had not been hiding up here. She had been watching. She had a record of every trespass, every armed man who had crossed onto her land, every truck, every survey team, every probe of her defenses, all of it logged and timed and stored in three separate places where Caldwell's people would never think to look. My God, Ryan said, paging through it. You documented everything. 8 months of it. This isn't just a sniper's hide, Charlie. This is a case file. That was always the point, she said. The rifle was never the plan. The rifle is just what keeps me alive long enough for the rest of it to matter. Noah studied her with new respect. You've been building a courtroom up here this whole time. I've been building a trap, Charlie corrected. There's a difference. A courtroom waits for the criminal to be brought in. A trap brings him to you. Lucas looked up from the maps he'd been marking. And you want to bring Caldwell himself up this mountain? Eventually, yes. The table went quiet. They all understood what that meant. You did not lure a man like Richard Caldwell anywhere. He moved when he chose, struck when he chose, and was never ever in a place he hadn't already decided was safe. That's insane, Harper said flatly. Forgive me, Hayes, but a man at that level doesn't walk into a trap. He sends people, layers of them. He'll be 1,000 miles away when whatever happens here happens. He will, Charlie agreed, until he won't. She leaned over the map. Because here's the thing about men like Caldwell, that you only learn after you've hunted enough of them. They don't fear death. They've insulated themselves from it so completely that it stopped being real to them years ago. What they fear, the only thing they fear, is losing control of a situation. And Briggs just lost control of this one in the most public, humiliating way possible. 4 of his men dead or scattered in operation he personally ordered collapsing on a mountain in Idaho because of one woman he can't even identify. She looked up at them. A man like Caldwell can't tolerate that. Not because of the evidence, because of the embarrassment. Sooner or later, his pride is going to demand he come look at the thing that beat him with his own eyes. And when he does, I'm going to be ready. Harper stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly the old Marine shook his head, and there was something almost like awe in it. 15 years ago, he said quietly, I stood in a room and said women didn't have the killer instinct for special operations. He looked around the table at the maps, at the case file, at the woman who had built a war out of nothing but patience and rage. I have never, he said, been more completely wrong about anything in my entire life. Nobody laughed. It wasn't the kind of moment for it. They worked through that night and the next day and the night after that, and the mountain changed under their hands. Noah found firing positions Charlie hadn't even known she had. Lucas began turning the approaches into something that would make any assault team bleed for every yard. Ryan organized supplies, medical caches, fallback points. Harper spent hours on a satellite phone that couldn't be traced, speaking in careful coded language to men in distant offices who had been waiting their whole careers for a phone call exactly like this one. And Charlie watched it all come together and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, and it took her 2 full days to recognize what it was. It was hope. She was standing on the porch on the 3rd night, looking out at the dark when Ryan came and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. You did it, he said after a while. Did what? Built something nobody could have built alone, that bunker, that case. 8 months by yourself, no backup, no sleep. Half these names able to make you disappear with a phone call. He shook his head. Charlie, I've known you 20 years. I've watched you do impossible things. This is the most impossible thing I've ever seen you do. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was quiet. I almost didn't make it the call, she said, even after Briggs came, even after I knew the real ones were coming. I sat on that porch with the phone in my hand for 2 days, Ryan. 2 days, because some part of me had decided it was better to die up here alone than to drag any of you into it. She turned to look at him. I don't know when I started thinking like that, when asking for help became the same as failing. But it did. Somewhere along the way it did. Ryan was quiet for a moment. You want to know the truth, he said finally. Every one of us up here thinks like that. Every single one. It's what the job did to us. It taught us that the only person you can count on is yourself, and then it sent us home to a country that proved it over and over. He sipped his coffee. But that's a lie, Charlie. It always was. The strongest thing you ever did wasn't holding this mountain alone for 8 months. It was picking up that phone. Charlie looked out at the dark, and she did not trust herself to speak. That was the moment the radio on the table inside crackled to life. It was one of Noah's perimeter sensors, the ones buried 2 miles out along the only real approach, the ones that were not supposed to trip, unless something large and deliberate was moving up the mountain in the dead of night. It tripped. Then another one tripped behind it. Then a third. Charlie set down her coffee. Inside, she could hear the others going still, hear the easy talk die, hear the particular silence of trained people understanding all at once that the waiting was over. Noah appeared in the doorway, and his face told her everything. Multiple contacts, he said quietly, moving up the main approach. Spread out, disciplined, no lights. These aren't Briggs's leftovers, Charlie. These are professionals, a lot of them. Charlie felt the old cold settle into her chest, the one that had kept her alive across 3 wars, the one that turned fear into focus. How many? She asked. Noah looked at the readout in his hand, and when he answered, his voice was flat and certain. 14, he said. 14 contacts moving in coordinated teams. They've been planning this approach. They know the terrain almost as well as we do. He looked up. Almost. Lucas was already moving grabbing gear, his grin coming back now that the talking was finally over. 14 against 5, he said, on our mountain in the dark. He shook his head, almost cheerful. I almost feel bad for them. Don't, Charlie said, and she lifted her rifle off the table and felt the familiar weight of it settle into her hands like an old conversation resuming. These men came up here to kill us, to bury that bunker, and to make sure nobody ever knows what those names did. They made their choice when they started climbing. She looked around the room at the 4 faces watching her, the 4 people who had come when she finally found the strength to ask. Now we make ours. She turned to Harper. Colonel, you're not in this fight. You're too valuable, and you know it. I need you on that phone. The second the shooting starts, I want your people to know it started. I want a record. I want timestamps. If we don't make it through tonight, I want the world to know exactly who came up this mountain and exactly what they came to bury. Harper nodded, the old Marine, all business now. Understood. Noah, you're my eyes. I want to know where every one of them is before they know where any of us are. Already on it. Lucas, the approaches are yours. Make them pay for every foot. My favorite words in the English language. Ryan, fallback point medical, and you keep the case file safe. If it comes to it, that file leaves this mountain even if we don't. It'll leave, Ryan said. I promise you that. Charlie nodded once. Then she looked out the window into the dark mountain where 14 professional killers were climbing toward her in the night, believing that numbers and training and the backing of the most powerful man in the country guaranteed them victory. They did not know the mountain. She did. She had spent 8 months learning every rock, every ridge, every blind angle and false trail and killing ground it had to offer. She had memorized it the way other people memorize the faces of the people they loved. She had not chosen this fight, but she had chosen this ground. And on this ground, with these people finally standing beside her, she was no longer the hunted woman on the mountain. She was the mountain itself. They think they're coming to win, Charlie said quietly, watching the dark. They think superior numbers settle it. They think this is 14 against 1 tired veteran they can't even name. She worked the bolt of her rifle, and the small mechanical sound was very loud in the silent room. Let them keep thinking that, right up until the moment the mountain decides they don't belong. Outside, far down the slope, the first of 14 shadows crossed onto land that did not belong to them, climbing toward a fight they were absolutely certain they would win. Above them in the dark, the woman they had come to kill chambered around and went still and waited. The first shadow died without ever knowing the mountain had been watching him for an hour. Noah's voice came soft and steady through Charlie's earpiece, calm as a man reading off the weather. Lead element 4 men crossing the dry creek at the base of the south approach. They're moving in pairs covering each other, professional spacing. Whoever trained them was good. A pause. Second element behind them, 6 men holding back 200 yards. They're using the first 4 to find your defenses for them. Smart, Charlie murmured. She lay flat on the high ridge of the same position from which she'd ended Briggs's operation a week before, the cold rock familiar against her body now. They're spending the first 4 to map us. They expect to lose them. Then let's not disappoint them about the losing part, Lucas said over the channel. And somewhere down the slope, Charlie heard him laugh quietly to himself. Charlie, the moment your guy at the front puts his foot on the flat rock by the split pine, you tell me. I left him a present there. Copy. She watched through the scope. The lead man moved well, scanning careful a real operator and not one of Briggs's drunks. He came up the trail toward the split pine and Charlie waited, breathing slow, and at the exact moment his boot came down on the flat rock, she said one word. Now, the mountain answered. The charge Lucas had set went off with a flat, hard crack that rolled across the dark slope, and the lead element simply ceased to be a coordinated team. Charlie didn't even need to fire. The blast did the first man's work, and the chaos did the rest, and through her scope, she watched the survivors scatter screaming into their radios, firing at shadows exactly the way Briggs's men had fired at shadows a week ago. 2 down from the charge, Noah reported. 2 running. They're broken, Charlie. They don't know where the hit came from. They will, she said, and she settled the crosshairs on a man who had stopped behind a boulder to key his radio, and she fired once, and the man stopped keying his radio forever. 3 down, Noah said. Far below, the second element went to ground. Charlie watched the discipline ripple through them, watched them realize all at once that the first 4 had not stumbled into an ambush, but had been deliberately sacrificed by an enemy who'd been waiting and had given up nothing in return. That got their attention, Lucas said cheerfully. Don't get comfortable, Charlie answered. The smart one's still down there. Watch the man who isn't moving. Everybody else is reacting, he's thinking. That's the one who's actually dangerous. She was right. While the rest of the second element scrambled for cover, one man at the rear had gone perfectly still behind a fallen log, and Charlie watched him through the scope and felt a cold flicker of recognition. He wasn't panicking. He was studying the mountain the way she studied it, reading the angles working backward from where the shots had come, and she understood with sudden certainty that this was the man Caldwell had actually sent. The leader, the professional, the one who'd been hired because he was as good at this as she was. Noah, she said quietly, the still one, behind the log at the base of the south face, that's their commander. I see him. He's reading us. He's going to figure out my position in about 90 seconds. She was already moving and sliding back off the ridge, breaking down the hide. I'm relocating. The second I leave this spot, I want everybody to assume he knows where it was. Do not use the south ridge. He'll be watching it. She had learned that too over a long career. The first rule of surviving an enemy as good as you was to never let him be right about you twice. She crawled 40 yards along a route she'd cleared months ago, a path invisible from below, and settled into a second position with a completely different angle on the slope. And the moment she'd done it, a shot cracked out of the dark from somewhere down below and struck the exact spot of rock where she had been lying 30 seconds before. He found your first hide, Noah said. I know, Charlie answered, and despite everything, a thin, grim smile touched her mouth. Good. Now he thinks he understands me. That's the most dangerous thing I can let him believe. Down the mountain, the man behind the log lowered his rifle and frowned at the empty ridge where his shot had hit nothing. He had calculated her position perfectly. The shot should have ended it, and the fact that it hadn't, the fact that she had moved at the precise moment he had worked it out, told him something that made the skin on his arms prickle. She was as good as he was, maybe better. He keyed his radio. All elements hold. The target is not one shooter holding a line. She's mobile, she's reading us, and she's got support. This isn't a hit. This is an engagement against a prepared, trained defense. A pause. Recalculate. We do this slow. But slow was exactly what Charlie wanted, because slow gave Lucas time. While the assault team reassessed holding their positions, trying to find an approach that wasn't already a killing ground, Lucas Grant was moving through the dark below them like a man wandering through his own backyard, and he was leaving presence everywhere he went. He'd had 3 days to prepare this mountain, and 3 days for Lucas Grant was 3 days too many to give a man who loved his work the way Lucas loved his. Charlie, he said over the channel, breathless and delighted. They're stacking up at the base of the east draw. They think it's a soft approach because it's the only one I didn't obviously fortify. Is it a soft approach? Charlie, she could hear the grin. It's the least soft approach on this entire mountain. I just made it look soft. Tell me when you want it. She watched the assault team's second element, where it began to flow toward the east, draw 6 men moving in disciplined pairs, believing they'd found the seam in her defenses. Let them commit, she said. All the way in, then collapse it. My favorite words, Lucas breathed. She waited. The men flowed into the draw deeper, deeper, the whole element committing to the approach, and at the exact moment the last man cleared the entrance, Lucas's voice said, "Good night," and the east draw came apart. It wasn't one charge. It was a sequence timed, each one funneling the survivors of the waste into the path of the next. And Charlie watched through her scope as a coordinated six-man element became four, then three, then a handful of broken men crawling back the way they'd come, and she picked off the two who reached open ground, because dead men told no stories, but she could not afford witnesses calling in her positions. "East element is finished," Noah reported, and even his flat voice carried something now. "Charlie, that's 8. 8 of 14 in under an hour, and we haven't taken a scratch." "Don't say it," Ryan cut in from the fallback point. "Don't you dare say it's going well. The second somebody says it's going well, it stops going well. That's a law of the universe." He was right, of course. He was always right about that. Because down below, the commander behind the log had finished recalculating, and he had arrived at a conclusion that was unfortunately for him entirely correct. "She's not defending the mountain," he said into his radio, and his voice had gone very flat and very cold. "She's defending a point. Everything she's done has channeled us away from one specific area. The structure? She's protecting the structure on the survey." A pause. "All remaining elements disregard the approaches. New objective. We push directly for the structure. She can't defend it and hold us off at the same time. Force her to choose." In her earpiece, Charlie heard Noah's sharp intake of breath. "Charlie, he's figured it out. 6 men remaining, and they're abandoning the approaches. They're driving straight for the bunker." And there it was, the twist she had feared most. Not the numbers, not the firepower, the intelligence. The one thing she could not outshoot was an enemy commander smart enough to ignore her traps entirely and aim for the only thing she could not afford to lose. For 1/2 second, Charlie felt the cold edge of real fear, the kind she hadn't let herself feel in 8 months. Then she felt something else. She felt the trap close. "Lucas," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm. "He took the bait." There was a pause on the channel. "Charlie," Lucas said slowly, "please tell me what I think you mean is what you mean. The bunker approach, the one obvious path to the structure, the one I forgot to fortify." She was already moving again, repositioning to overwatch the killing ground she had spent 8 months designing for exactly this moment. "I needed him to be smart, Lucas. I needed him to be smart enough to stop attacking where I was strong and drive straight for what he thought I couldn't defend. Because that path, the path to the bunker, is the only ground on this entire mountain I have completely, absolutely total control of." Down below, the commander, the smartest man Caldwell had sent, gathered his 6 survivors and led them confidently up the one approach Charlie had left open, certain he had finally outthought her, certain he had found the move that forced her to choose between her life and her evidence. He had not outthought her. He had done exactly what she'd spent 8 months making him want to do. "Noah," Charlie said, "confirm they are all in the corridor, every one of them. I don't want a single one of them standing outside it when it goes." "Stand by." A long, tense pause. Charlie could hear her own heartbeat. "Lead 2 are at the midpoint, middle pair just entered. Last 2. Another pause. "Last 2 are in. All 6, Charlie. All 6 are in the corridor." Charlie closed her eyes for 1/2 second. She thought strangely of the realtor who told her the mountain had no history. She thought of Sheriff Carter climbing her steps uninvited. She thought of Ryan asking where he was needed of Harper, saying he'd been wrong, of all the impossible weight she'd carried alone for 8 months that she was no longer carrying alone. Then she opened her eyes. "Lucas," she said, "close it." What happened next was not a battle. It was the mountain doing exactly what Charlie had spent 8 months teaching it to do. The corridor to the bunker, the soft approach to the undefended path, had never been a path at all. It had been a machine, and Lucas had built it, and every charge, every collapse point, every channel had been waiting in patient silence for the precise moment when an enemy smart enough to find it would lead his men into it. The far end went first, sealing the retreat, then the flanks one after another in a sequence Charlie had walked in her mind 100 times. The 6 men who had been so certain they'd outmaneuvered her found themselves in a space that was coming apart in a precise, deliberate, inescapable order, and there was nowhere to go that hadn't already been chosen for them. Charlie did not feel triumph. She had killed too many men to ever feel triumph. She felt only the cold, clean, terrible focus of a job being finished, and she did her part of it from the overwatch with a steady hand, and when the dust settled and the echoes died, the corridor to the bunker was silent. Confirm, she said quietly. It took Noah a long time to answer. When he did, his voice was subdued, the cheer entirely gone. All six, the whole remaining force. Charlie, he trailed off. 14 came up this mountain. 14. And it's over and we don't have a single casualty. I've never seen anything like it, not in 20 years, not anywhere. The channel was quiet for a moment. 5 people on a dark mountain, breathing alive, processing the fact that they had just done something that should not have been possible. Then Lucas's voice came through, and for once it held no joke. Charlie, he said, that commander, the smart one, he was good, really good, the best I've seen in years. A pause. And you played him like a fiddle from the first minute. You let him think he was winning right up until you'd walked him exactly where you needed him. That wasn't a gunfight. That was a chess game, and the rest of us were just the pieces you moved. Another pause. I'm not sure if I should be terrified of you or in love with you. Neither, Charlie said. Just alive. That's enough for tonight. She came down off the mountain as the first gray light touched the eastern ridges, stiff and exhausted, and emptied out, and the others met her at the cabin. And for a moment, the 5 of them just stood there, in the yard looking at each other alive, the impossible night behind them. Harper was the first to speak. The old colonel had spent the whole engagement on the satellite phone, and his face was gray with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite imminent awe. My people have it all, he said quietly. Timestamps. The whole engagement logged in real time fed to 3 separate federal contacts as it happened. There's a record now, Hayes, a clean one. Whatever else happens, the world is going to know that 14 professional operators assaulted a private citizen's land in the dead of night, and there's only one reason a force like that gets assembled and sent. He looked at her. Somebody with a great deal of money and a great deal to hide. We can trace the men. We can trace the money. And the money is going to lead exactly where you've been saying it leads. To Caldwell, Charlie said. To Caldwell. But Charlie was already shaking her head slowly, and the others saw her expression change, saw the exhaustion give way to something harder, and the small, fragile relief in the yard began to drain away. It won't be enough, she said. Ryan frowned. Charlie, 14 men, a federal record, traceable money. That's a case. That's a real case. It's a case against the men who came up this mountain, Charlie said. It's a case against Briggs, who's probably already dead. It's a case against a dozen operators and the money that hired them. She looked at the steel door's direction at the mountain that had held its secret for 50 years. But it is not a case against Caldwell. Not yet. Because a man like Caldwell has spent his entire life building layers between himself and the men who do his work. The money will lead to a contractor, and the contractor will lead to a shell company, and the shell company will lead to a lawyer who will fall on his sword for a number with a lot of zeros, and Caldwell will stand up in front of the cameras and say he is shocked, simply shocked that his name has been dragged into this, and he will walk. Her voice was flat and certain and bitter with experience. I've watched it happen. I watched it happen with something a lot smaller than this, and it cost people I loved their lives, and the man responsible got a promotion and a pension. The yard was silent. Then what was all this for? Lucas asked quietly. If it's not enough to put him away, what did we just do all this for? Charlie turned to face them, all of them, the 4 people who had come up her mountain when she finally found the strength to ask. This was never about surviving tonight, she said. Surviving tonight was just the price of admission. Tonight proves they came. Tonight proves they wanted that bunker badly enough to send 14 professionals to kill a woman in her own home. Tonight makes it impossible for Caldwell to pretend none of this is happening. She let that settle. But it doesn't make a case against him. The only thing that makes a case against him is Caldwell himself on this mountain, making decisions, giving orders in front of evidence we control. She looked at Harper. He has to come here. He has to come here, personally believing he's in control, believing he's cleaning up a mess. And we have to make him want to come so badly that his pride overrides every instinct he spent 30 years developing. Harper stared at her. You're talking about luring the most insulated, most protected, most dangerous man in the defense establishment into walking personally onto the exact ground where you control everything. Yes, that's not a plan, Hayes. That's a fantasy. Men like Caldwell don't come to the mountain. They send the mountain to you. They do, Charlie agreed, until something happens that they cannot stand to watch from a distance, until their pride becomes a bigger threat to them than the danger. She looked around the circle of tired, alive, disbelieving faces. Briggs failed, and Caldwell sent professionals. The professionals just failed worse than Briggs did on a federal record in a way he cannot bury or deny or spin away. 14 of his best beaten by one woman he still cannot even name. A cold light came into her eyes. A man like that, who has controlled every room he's ever walked into, who has never once in his life lost and had to watch it happen, is going to be lying awake right now with a question eating a hole in him. And it's the same question every powerful man eventually can't resist. Who is she? How did she do this? And the only way he'll ever truly know is to come and see for himself, Harper finished slowly. Is to come and see for himself, Charlie said. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The sun climbed a little higher over the eastern ridges, and the light moved across the yard, and 5 exhausted people stood in it and understood all at once that the hardest part of this was not behind them at all. The fight on the mountain had been the easy part. What came next was something far more dangerous because it could not be won with a rifle or a charge or superior ground. It could only be won with patience and nerve and the willingness to invite the most dangerous man in the country to walk straight up to you and believe right until the end that he was the one in control. Charlie looked at the steel door, at the secret it had held for 50 years, at the evidence men had killed for and would kill for again. He'll come, she said quietly. His pride won't let him do anything else. And when he does, I'm going to make absolutely certain that every single thing he says, every order he gives, every threat he makes is recorded, witnessed, and beyond any power on earth to bury. She turned and walked toward the cabin, and at the door she stopped, and she looked back at the 4 people who had refused to let her face this alone. Get some sleep, she said. All of you, because the shooting part is over and the part that actually matters hasn't even started yet. Richard Caldwell read the report 3 times before he set it down, and then he sat alone in his office for a long while without moving at all. 14 men, 14 of the best operators money could buy, vetted, equipped, briefed, and sent up a mountain in the dead of night to remove 1 woman and recover 1 stockpile of evidence. And every single one of them was gone. Not captured, not wounded, gone. And the woman was still up there, still breathing, still sitting on top of 50 years of names that could bury him. He had spent 30 years being the man who made problems disappear. He did not lose. Losing was a thing that happened to other people, to weaker people, to men who hadn't built the careful, insulated machine he'd spent his entire life building around himself. And now a problem he should have erased in a single night had instead erased the men he'd sent, and there was a federal record of it, and his lawyers were already calling him, in careful, nervous voices telling him the money trail was a problem, the contractor was a problem, that he needed to get ahead of this before it got ahead of him. But that was not what kept Richard Caldwell awake that night. What kept him awake was a single question, small and sharp and impossible to set down. Who was she? He had read everything. A former Navy SEAL sniper, decorated, retired, quiet. A woman who had bought a worthless mountain with the last of her savings and gone up there to disappear from the world. Nothing in the file explained how a single retired veteran had taken apart 14 professional operators on open ground without losing one of her own. Nothing in the file explained how she had known they were coming. Nothing in the file explained the absolute surgical, contemptuous ease of it. And Richard Caldwell, who had controlled every room he had ever walked into, who had never once in his life lost and been forced to sit and watch it happen, discovered something that had never happened to him before. He could not stand not knowing. It was his lawyers would later realize the first mistake he had made in 30 years. 200 miles away on the mountain, Charlie Hayes was watching her phone. Not the untraceable one, the other one. The one whose number was buried under a dozen layers of shell companies and dead corporations. The number that if a man with enough money and enough motivation went looking, could eventually be traced back to the woman who had bought a worthless mountain in Idaho. She had made certain it could be traced. That had been the entire point. You really think he'll call, Ryan said. He was sitting across from her at the table, and he had been watching her watch the phone for the better part of an hour. You really think Richard Caldwell, of all the men on God's earth, is going to pick up a telephone and personally call the woman who just killed 14 of his men? I think his pride is going to call, Charlie said. I don't think he'll be able to help it. He's spent his whole life being the smartest, most dangerous man in every room he walks into. And right now, there's a woman on a mountain he can't explain, can't beat, and can't stop thinking about. She turned the phone over slowly in her hands. Men like that don't fear death, Ryan. I keep telling you that. They fear losing control of a situation. And the only way Caldwell gets control of this back, the only way he makes that question stop eating at him, is to take it over personally. To come here and look at me with his own eyes and prove to himself that he's still the most dangerous man in the room. And when he does, Harper said quietly from across the cabin, he walks onto the one piece of ground in this entire country where he is not the most dangerous man in the room. That's the idea, Charlie said. The phone rang. Nobody moved. The sound of it was very loud in the small cabin, and they all looked at it, and Charlie let it ring twice more before she picked it up. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly steady, the voice of a woman who had all the time in the world. Hayes, she said. There was a pause on the line, a long one. And then a voice she had never heard but had imagined for 8 months, smooth and unhurried, and entirely without warmth, said, "Do you know who this is?" "I know exactly who this is, Mr. Caldwell," Charlie said. "I've been waiting for your call for a while now." Another pause, longer this time. She had surprised him, and she could feel it through the line, the small recalibration of a man who had expected fear and gotten none. "You're a difficult woman to find," Caldwell said. "No, I'm not," Charlie said. "You found me just fine. You sent Briggs, and when Briggs failed, you sent 14 men to finish what he couldn't. I'd say you found me very easily, Mr. Caldwell. You just keep sending people who can't do the job." She let that sit. "Maybe it's time you considered doing it yourself." It was a gamble and a large one. Push too hard and he would smell the trap. Push too soft and he would never leave the safety of his marble offices. She had spent 2 days deciding exactly how to play this conversation, every line of it, and now she was playing it, and the whole thing balanced on the edge of a knife. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed softly, and it was a cold, careful sound, a man who had learned to laugh the way other men learn to fence. "You want me to come there," he said. "I want this to end," Charlie said. "I'm tired, Mr. Caldwell. I've been sitting on this mountain for 8 months guarding a hole in the ground full of old paper, and I'm tired of it. You want what's down there. I want my life back. So instead of sending more men up here to die, maybe you and I sit down like adults and find a number that makes all of this go away." She paused. "You can do that. You're the man with the money. Briggs was an errand boy. The men you sent the other night were errand boys. I don't negotiate with errand boys. I negotiate with the man who signs the checks." It was exactly the right thing to say to a man like Caldwell, and Charlie knew it because she had spent her entire career studying men exactly like Caldwell, and every one of them believed in his deepest and most private heart that everything in the world eventually came down to a number, that every person had a price, that the woman on the mountain was nothing more than one more thing to be purchased and filed away. "You'd sell it," Caldwell said. It was not quite a question. "I'd sell my silence," Charlie said. "The evidence stays exactly where it is. You and I both walk away knowing it's down there and knowing I'll release every single page of it the second anything happens to me. That's the deal. You buy my silence, and the insurance policy comes with it. Anything happens to me, the whole thing goes public the same day to people even you can't reach." She let her voice harden just slightly, just enough. "And believe me, Mr. Caldwell, after the other night, you know I've got the means to make sure of it." The line was quiet for a long, long moment. She could hear him thinking. She could hear 30 years of caution wrestling against something older and uglier, something that had been gnawing at him since he read that report. When Caldwell spoke again, his voice had changed just slightly, and Charlie heard it, and she knew in that moment that she had him. "I'll consider it," he said. "Don't consider it too long," Charlie said. "I'm not a patient woman, and the longer this drags on, the more I start thinking, maybe I'd rather just hand the whole thing to a journalist and be done with you entirely. You've got 48 hours to decide whether you want to come settle this like a man or whether you'd rather read about yourself in the morning papers." And then before he could answer, before he could regain even a single inch of control over the conversation, she hung up. The cabin was silent. Ryan let out a slow breath. "Charlie," he said, "you just hung up on Richard Caldwell." "I did. You hung up on the most dangerous man in the country." "Especially him," Charlie said. "Especially him. A man like Caldwell has never once in his life had someone hang up on him. It'll eat at him worse than anything I could have said. By tonight, he won't be able to think about anything else." She set the phone down on the table. "He'll come. I'd stake everything on it. His pride won't survive being dismissed by a woman on a mountain. He has to come now. He has to come and reestablish that he's the one in control. That's exactly the man I've been counting on him being from the very start." Harper was watching her with an expression caught somewhere between admiration and dread. "And if you've misjudged him," the old colonel asked quietly, "if instead of coming he simply sends another 50 men, or worse, Hayes, if he decides the cleanest solution is to put something on this mountain from a very long way off and erase all of us and the bunker and the whole problem in a single afternoon." It was the question none of them had wanted to say out loud, and Charlie did not flinch from it. "He won't," she said. "Not yet. And here's why." She leaned forward over the table, and the others leaned in with her without meaning to. "He still doesn't know exactly where the evidence is. He knows it's somewhere in the bunker, but that bunker is deep, and it's old Cold War engineering built to survive a nuclear strike built to outlast nations. He can't just level this mountain and be certain he got every page. There could be copies. There could be a second cache. As long as there's even a chance, the one thing that can destroy him survives underneath the rubble, he doesn't dare bring the rubble down. He needs to recover it, specifically with his own people, with his own eyes. And to do that, he needs access." She looked around the room. "That's the leash I've had around his neck this whole time, and he doesn't even know he's wearing it. He can't kill this mountain without risking that the very thing he's trying to destroy outlives him. So he has to play my game. He has to come close. And the closer he comes, the more of himself he has to expose." Lucas, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. "And when he's close," he said slowly, "and exposed, that's when it's not a negotiation anymore. That's when it's a confession." "That's when it's a confession," Charlie said. The 48 hours that followed were the longest any of them had lived through in a long time, longer in their own way than the night the 14 had come up the mountain, because waiting was always harder than fighting. Fighting at least had the mercy of motion. Waiting had nothing but the slow grind of the clock and the steady weight of everything that could go wrong. Sheriff Carter came up the mountain on the first day, and Charlie brought him fully into the planning because he was the one piece of the puzzle that mattered most now. Not the rifle, not the charges, the law. "Everything that's happened up here so far," Charlie told him, spreading it across the table, the logs, the timestamps, the federal record, Harper's people were holding, the shootings, the assault, all of it. That's a mess of self-defense in federal jurisdiction and a dozen lawyers who'll spend years arguing about who had the right to do what to whom. It might put Caldwell's errand boys away. It will never touch the man himself." She looked at the old sheriff steadily. "But what's about to happen is something different. If Caldwell comes up this mountain and gives an order, makes a threat, admits to even one piece of what he's done, and a sworn officer of the law witnesses it and documents it clean, that's not a mess. That's a crime committed in front of a witness on the record in a way that no amount of money can argue into a fog." Carter studied the layout on the table for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. "You want me here," he said, "when he comes." "I want you here, and I want you legitimate," Charlie said. "Everything by the book. I've spent 8 months building this so that when it finally breaks, it breaks clean, in a way no army of lawyers can bury. And you're the cleanest part of all of it, Sheriff. A 26-year county lawman with no connection to me, no connection to the military, no connection to any of this, who came up here to investigate a crime on his own jurisdiction and witnessed a confession with his own ears." Carter was quiet, turning it over. "You really think a man like that confesses anything to anybody?" he said finally. "Men like Caldwell don't confess. They give speeches. They make a person feel small and then they leave." "He'll confess," Charlie said, "because he won't think of it as confessing. He'll think of it as explaining. To a man like Caldwell, talking down to the people he's beaten isn't a risk. It's a pleasure. It's the whole reason he's coming. He's not coming up here to listen to my terms, Sheriff. He's coming up here to look the woman who cost him 14 men in the eye and let her understand exactly how far out of her depth she is. He's going to want me to know who he is and what he's capable of." She held the old lawman's gaze. "And the entire time he's doing it, every word he says is going to land in 3 places he can't reach. He'll be making a speech. He just won't know who the audience is." Carter was silent for a long beat. Then slowly the old sheriff took off his hat, looked at it in his hands, and set it back on his head squared. 26 years, he said. 26 years I've been the law in this county, and you know what that's amounted to: writing tickets, pulling drunks out of ditches, filling out forms about things that didn't matter to anybody but the people they happened to. And every few years, somebody big does something terrible, and I watch them walk because somebody makes a phone call, and the phone call goes over my head and lands somewhere I can't follow." He looked at her. "If this is the one that matters, Hayes, if this is the one time in 26 years where the law actually means something." He nodded once firmly. "Then I'm in, all the way in, and God help Richard Caldwell." While Carter handled the law, Harper worked the federal side, careful coded calls to trusted contacts, men he'd vouched for with his own life and reputation, positioning them close but never too close, ready to move. The instant Charlie gave the word, but invisible until that instant came. Because the entire plan depended on Caldwell believing he was walking into a quiet negotiation with a tired, isolated, beaten-down woman who wanted a payday and a way out, and not into a documented federal operation engineered to capture his every breath. "The hard part," Harper said on the evening of the first day, hanging up another call, his face gray with the strain of it, "isn't getting my people here. The hard part is keeping them far enough back that Caldwell's advance team doesn't trip over them. He's going to sweep this mountain before he ever sets foot on it. Hayes, he'll have men checking every approach, every ridge, every place a person could hide. If they find even one of mine, the whole thing collapses, and it collapses with all of us standing on top of it." "Then they won't find them," Charlie said, and she turned to the corner of the room where Noah Bennett had been sitting so quietly that once again they had half forgotten he was there. "Will they?" Noah looked up. "No," he said simply. "They won't. I'll position your people, Colonel. I'll put them in places Caldwell's men will walk right past and never see the same way I walked through Charlie's perimeter the night I got here. Your people stay where I put them. They don't move, they don't breathe wrong, and Caldwell's sweep comes up clean." He almost smiled. "Let him think he's swept the mountain. Let him think it's safe. That's the most dangerous thing we can let him believe." Ryan secured the medical and the fallback positions, the same careful work he'd done before the 14 came, because the one thing none of them could afford to do was assume this would go cleanly. Lucas denied the simple joy of blowing anything up this time, contented himself with making absolutely certain that every approach to the meeting site was covered, that there was no angle Caldwell's people could exploit, no escape route he hadn't accounted for, no surprise hiding in the terrain. And Charlie prepared the one thing that mattered more than all the rest of it put together: the recording. Not one device, but a dozen redundant, hidden weatherproof, each of them feeding the moment it activated, to 3 separate locations beyond the mountain, so that no matter what Caldwell brought, no matter what jamming or sweeping or electronic countermeasures his money could buy, the words the man spoke on that mountain would survive and reach people he could not reach and could not silence. Everything he says, she told them, on the second night, the last night the cabin lit low, and the 5 of them and the sheriff gathered close around the table. Every single word lands in 3 places at once the moment he opens his mouth. Harper's federal contacts, who had been waiting their whole careers for evidence like this. A journalist I've trusted for 15 years who's been sitting on the outline of this story waiting for the one piece that makes it undeniable. And a dead man's archive that releases everything automatically if I don't personally reset it every 12 hours. She looked around the table at each of them. "What that means is this: even if it all goes wrong up here tomorrow, even if Caldwell brings something we didn't plan for, and none of us walk off this mountain, the record survives. The truth survives. That's the whole point. That's the only thing that has ever mattered. Caldwell can kill the witnesses. He cannot kill the evidence. Not anymore. I made sure of that 8 months ago, before any of you were here, before I even knew if anyone would come." Lucas shook his head slowly, looking at her across the table with something close to wonder. You've thought of everything, he said. No, Charlie said quietly. I've thought of everything I could think of. There's a difference, and it's a big one. A man like Caldwell didn't claw his way to where he is by being predictable. Tomorrow he is going to do something I haven't planned for. He always will. They always do. The only thing I can honestly promise any of you is that I've built so much redundancy into this that one surprise, even a bad one, won't be enough to sink the whole thing. She looked toward the steel door's direction, toward the secret the mountain had kept for 50 years. We've done everything we can do. Every piece is in place. Now it comes down to whether Caldwell is the man I've bet all our lives he is. Ryan was watching her carefully across the table the way a medic watches a patient. You've bet a lot more than our lives on it, he said quietly. You understand that you've been carrying this for 8 months. If he doesn't come, if he sends men instead, if he finds a way around all of it, that's not just a tactical failure, Charlie. That's 8 months of your life. That's everything you've poured into this rock. He leaned forward. I have to ask you before tomorrow, and I need you to be straight with me. After everything, after the bunker, after the maze, after the 14, is it worth it to you? Is it worth dying for? The cabin went very still. It was the question underneath all the other questions, and they had all been carrying it, and only Ryan had the standing to ask it out loud. Charlie was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice was lower than before, and it carried something the others rarely heard from her. I told you once, she said, that I tried trusting the system before, with something smaller than this. I never told you what. She looked down at her hands. There were people I served with. Good people. Better than me. And there was a man not so different from Caldwell who diverted what they needed to stay alive into a contract that lined his own pockets. And they died. They died because of a number on a page in an office 1,000 miles from where they were bleeding out. Her jaw tightened. And I had the evidence. I had it in my hands. And I did exactly what you're supposed to do. I took it up the chain. I trusted the system, and the system buried it and buried them, and the man got a promotion and a pension and a quiet retirement, and I got to attend the funerals and shake hands with the families and say nothing because the people I trusted told me it was handled. She looked up, and her eyes were dry, but there was something burning behind them. So yes, Ryan, to answer your question, is it worth dying for? I've been dying for it a little every day for 8 years. The only thing that's changed is that this one time, I've got the man's hand caught in the till, and I am not going to trust anyone up any chain to do the right thing. This time, the truth comes out in a way that nobody, not Caldwell, not his lawyers, not whoever he owns, can put back in the ground. She let out a slow breath. That's worth dying for. It's the only thing I've ever found that was. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Harper, the old colonel who had once stood in a room and said, "This woman didn't belong," reached across the table and put his weathered hand flat on the wood in front of her, an old soldier's gesture, simple and complete. "Then we'll see it through with you," he said, "all of us, to the end of it, whatever the end is." One by one, the others put their hands on the table beside his. Lucas grinning, but for once not joking. Noah silent as always, but present. Ryan. And last Sheriff Carter, the outsider, the local lawman, who had climbed this mountain uninvited and never once climbed back down. Charlie looked at the hands on the table and at the people they belonged to, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been clenched cold and tight for 8 years ease just slightly. Just enough. "All right," she said quietly, "then let's bring him up the mountain." The call came on the morning of the second day, right at the edge of the deadline, which Charlie had known it would because men like Caldwell never conceded a second of advantage they didn't have to. Charlie answered it on the first ring, and Caldwell's smooth, cold voice came down the line. And this time there was something underneath the smoothness, something she had been listening for. The need, the pride that couldn't let it go. The thing she had spent 2 days and 8 months counting on. "I've decided," Caldwell said, "that you and I should meet in person to discuss terms." Where Charlie said, though she already knew the answer she wanted and had spent 2 days making certain it was the only answer that could possibly make sense to a man like him. "There," Caldwell said, "your mountain. I find that I would like to see this place for myself. I would like to see the woman who has caused me so much trouble with my own eyes, and I would like to do it on the ground where she's caused it." A pause, and when he spoke again, there was an edge in it, a man reasserting control over a conversation that had slipped away from him once already. I'll come to you, Miss Hayes, but understand me very clearly. I won't come alone, and I won't come unprepared. My people will go over every inch of that mountain before I set foot on it. And if this is a trap, if there is so much as one thing waiting for me up there that shouldn't be, it will be the last mistake you ever make, and it will be a slow one. And Charlie Hayes, standing in her cabin with 4 former teammates and a county sheriff, watching her with 8 months and 3 wars and an entire lifetime of patience and grief, about to finally come to a single fine point, kept her voice perfectly level and said the only thing left to say. "Come ahead, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Bring whoever you like and look as hard as you want. I've got nothing up here but a hole in the ground and a tired woman who wants this over. I've been waiting for you longer than you could possibly imagine." She hung up. For a moment, nobody in the cabin moved. Then Harper let out a long, slow breath. Lucas grinned despite himself, the old, reckless grin. Ryan put his head briefly in his hands. Sheriff Carter quietly checked his sidearm out of pure habit. And Noah, who had been so still in the corner that they had once again half forgotten he was there, said softly, "He's coming." "He's coming," Charlie agreed. "Tomorrow," Noah said. "He'll need a day to position whatever he's bringing and run his sweep. He'll want overwatch. He'll want escape routes. He'll want his people on every approach before he ever shows his face. He's going to come up here believing he's the one who set the trap." He looked at Charlie across the dim cabin. "He's going to come up here believing all the way to the very end that he's in control of every piece of it." "Good," Charlie said. "That's exactly what he needs to believe. Right up until the moment he isn't." She walked to the window and looked out at the mountain that powerful men had believed for 50 years could bury the truth, the mountain that was about to become the place where the truth finally clawed its way back into the light. Behind her, the people who had refused to let her face this alone began quietly, methodically to make ready. And for the first time in 8 long months, Charlie Hayes was not afraid. She had carried this alone for so long that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to have people standing at her shoulder. She had believed for years that strength meant bearing every burden by herself, that asking for help was weakness, that trust was just a slower and crueler way of being betrayed. She knew better now. The mountain had taught her, or maybe the people on it had. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, not turning from the window, "I need every one of you to know something." She turned to face them, then the 4 she had served beside and the one she had only just met. 8 months ago, I'd made up my mind to die up here alone before I'd pick up a phone and ask any of you for help. I told myself that was strength. I told myself I was protecting you. She shook her head slowly. It wasn't strength. It was just loneliness wearing a uniform and calling itself a virtue. The strongest thing I ever did in my entire life wasn't holding this mountain by myself for 8 months. It was finally admitting I couldn't and dialing a number and letting you all stand beside me. She looked at each of them in turn. Ryan, who had asked only where he was needed. Lucas, who had called it a vacation. Noah, who had never planned to leave. Harper, who had driven up in the dark to say he'd been wrong. Carter, who had climbed her steps uninvited and never come down. "Whatever Caldwell brings up this mountain tomorrow," she said, "he's bringing it against 5 people who chose to be here, who chose it free and clear, for nothing but the truth and for each other. And there is nothing that man owns, no amount of money, no army he can hire, no judge he can buy that beats that. He's never had it. He's never once in his entire life had people who would stand on a mountain and face death beside him for no reason, but that it was right." Her voice was quiet and certain. "That's the one thing all his money can't buy. And tomorrow, that's the thing that's finally going to beat him." Outside, the sun moved slow across the high ridges, and the long shadows of the pines stretched down the slope. And somewhere 200 miles away, the most dangerous man in the country closed a file, summoned his people, and began to prepare to come and see with his own eyes the woman who had cost him everything. He believed he was coming up the mountain to take control of a situation that had slipped away from him. He was walking instead into the one place on the whole of the earth where every word he spoke would be witnessed, recorded, and placed forever beyond his reach. And the woman waiting for him at the top of it had spent 8 months and 3 wars and an entire hard lifetime learning exactly, precisely how to wait. He came up the mountain at noon exactly when he said he would, and he came like a man who already owned it. Charlie watched the convoy from her porch. 3 black vehicles grinding up the logging trail, and she did not move, and she did not reach for a weapon. That was the whole point. Caldwell needed to see a tired, beaten woman who'd run out of options. So she gave him one. She stood there with her hands loose at her sides and let him come. His advance team had swept the mountain for 6 hours that morning. Noah's positioning had held. They'd walked within 20 feet of 2 of Harper's federal contacts and never seen a thing. They checked every ridge, every approach, every place a careful man would think to look, and they'd come back to Caldwell and told him the mountain was clean, the woman was alone, the only other person present was a county sheriff who appeared to be there on legitimate business. Caldwell had believed them. Why wouldn't he? His people were the best money could buy. That was the problem with the best money could buy. They could only find what money knew to look for, and money had never learned how to look for Noah Bennett. The vehicle stopped at the base of the steps. Doors open. Men in dark clothes spread out, professional, watchful, and then Richard Caldwell himself stepped out of the center vehicle, and Charlie got her first look at the man she'd been hunting in the dark for 8 months. He was smaller than she'd imagined. They always were. The monsters she'd chased her whole life were never the size of the damage they did. "Miss Hayes," Caldwell said, looking up at her from the bottom of the steps. His voice was exactly as smooth in person as it had been on the phone. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," Charlie said. "I expected someone who looked like he could do his own dirty work." Something flickered in Caldwell's eyes just for a second. He was not a man accustomed to being spoken to that way, and she'd done it on purpose, the same thing she'd done on the phone, the small needle that kept him off balance, that kept his pride engaged instead of his caution. "May I come up?" he asked, and the politeness was a kind of contempt. "It's your mountain," Charlie said. "Isn't that what you came here to prove?" He climbed the steps. 2 of his men came with him. The rest fanned out across the yard, and down in the tree line, Charlie knew Lucas was tracking every one of them, and Noah was counting them, and Harper's people were waiting 200 yards out in positions no one had found. And Sheriff Carter stood at the corner of the porch in uniform badge, visible, a county lawman present, and accounted for, watching everything with the patient eyes of a man who had waited 26 years for one case that mattered. Caldwell noticed him. "Your sheriff makes me nervous, Miss Hayes." "He makes everybody nervous," Charlie said. "It's the mustache. Sheriff Carter's just here doing his job. There were some deaths on my property recently. He's investigating. You'd know about that." Another flicker. Caldwell looked at the sheriff for a long moment, calculating, and Charlie watched him decide that one old county lawman was not a threat worth aborting over. It was the second mistake he made. He was about to make several more. "Let's talk inside," Caldwell said. "No," Charlie said. "We talk out here, in the open. You brought men with guns onto my land, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not walking into an enclosed space with you. We talk right here where the sheriff can see us, or we don't talk at all, and you can go back to sending people who die in my dirt." It was a calculated risk. A man who suspected a trap would have balked. But Caldwell didn't suspect a trap because his people had swept the mountain, and the woman in front of him was tired and alone and reasonable, and asking only for the thing a guilty woman would ask for, which was safety. So he sat down in the chair she gestured to, and his men stood behind him, and Sheriff Carter stood at the corner of the porch, and a dozen hidden devices began silently to send every word to 3 places Richard Caldwell could not reach. "All right," Caldwell said. "Terms. You said you wanted a number." "I said I wanted my life back," Charlie said. "The number's how we get there. But before we talk about money, I want to understand exactly what I'm being paid to stay quiet about. Because I've read some of what's down in that bunker, Mr. Caldwell, but I haven't read all of it. 50 years is a lot of paper. So you tell me, what is it down there that's worth 14 men? What did I almost expose that made you spend that kind of blood?" And there it was, the opening. The invitation to a man who could not resist explaining to a beaten enemy exactly how far out of her depth she'd been. Caldwell smiled. "You really don't know," he said, and there was pleasure in it. Real pleasure, the pleasure of a man who has won and wants the loser to understand the full scope of the loss. "You've been guarding it for 8 months and you don't even know what you've got." "Then tell me," Charlie said. "I think I've earned that much. 14 men. Tell me what they died for." Caldwell leaned back in the chair. Behind him, his men relaxed slightly because their boss was relaxed, and that was the third mistake, the one that mattered, because Richard Caldwell, the most careful man in the defense establishment, the man who had spent 30 years building layers between himself and every word that could hurt him, leaned back in a chair on a mountain in Idaho and began with evident satisfaction to talk. That installation was built in 1961, he said. Cold War, a continuity site. And when they decommissioned it in the 80s, somebody made the decision to use it as an archive. A quiet place to keep records that certain people wanted kept, but didn't want found. Procurement records mostly. Contracts. The kind of paperwork that shows exactly where the money went and where it was supposed to go and the gap between the two. He spread his hands. Do you have any idea how much money moves through defense procurement, Miss Hayes, hundreds of billions? And every dollar of it has to be accounted for on paper by someone. That bunker is where the paper went that proved the accounting was a lie. 50 years of it. The contracts that were never fulfilled. The equipment that was billed and never delivered. The shell companies. The kickbacks. The names of every man who ever skimmed a fortune off the top of the nation's defense and made sure the evidence got buried in a hole in the mountains. And your name's in there, Charlie said quietly. My name is all over it, Caldwell said, and he said it the way a man brags. My name, my mentor's name, his mentor's name. 3 generations of it. I inherited that bunker the way other men inherit a watch. It's been my responsibility to keep it buried for 20 years. And I have kept it buried, Miss Hayes, through far worse threats than one retired sniper. Until you bought a mountain you had no business buying and started poking around in a hole you had no business opening. The deaths, Charlie said, in the bunker records, the diverted equipment, the men who died because the money that should have kept them alive went into someone's pocket instead. Those are in there too. For the first time, Caldwell's smile flickered. Casualties, he said, are a part of every enterprise. And Charlie Hayes, who had attended the funerals, who had shaken the hands of the families who had carried that specific grief like a stone in her chest for 8 years, looked at the small, smooth man in the chair and felt something go very cold and very still inside her. But she didn't move. She'd waited 8 months. She could wait 8 more minutes. So that's the deal, she said. I stay quiet about 3 generations of stolen fortunes and the men who died to make them. And in exchange, Caldwell said, you live and you become wealthy. I'm a generous man, Miss Hayes, to people who understand their position. Name a number. We both know you're going to take it because the alternative is that I leave this mountain and you have an accident and the bunker has a fire and in 6 months no one remembers either of you existed. He leaned forward. I genuinely prefer the first option. You're an impressive woman. It would be a waste. But make no mistake about which one we're choosing here. I came up this mountain personally to make sure you understood that there is no version of this where you win. There's only the version where you're paid and the version where you're erased. Those are the only 2 doors in the room. The porch was very quiet, and then Charlie Hayes smiled, and it was not the smile of a beaten woman, and Richard Caldwell saw it. And for the first time since he'd stepped out of the vehicle, something cold moved through him. There's a 3rd door, Charlie said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply turned her head slightly and spoke to the man standing at the corner of the porch. Sheriff Carter, she said, did you hear all that? Every word, Carter said, and he stepped forward off the corner, and his hand was already resting on his sidearm. Richard Caldwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, for solicitation of murder, and for about 40 other things my office is going to spend the next year writing down. You have the right to remain silent. I'd strongly advise you to start using it. Caldwell laughed. He actually laughed, and his men's hands went to their weapons, and the easy contempt came flooding back into his face. You foolish old man, he said. Do you have any idea who I am? You think a county sheriff and a washed-up sniper are going to arrest me on a mountain surrounded by my men? Your word against mine. A confession nobody heard but you. You'll be dead before you finish reading me. My rights and your county will be looking for a new sheriff by morning. Nobody heard but me, Carter agreed mildly. And the recording devices. The word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. 12 of them, Charlie said. Hidden, running since before you got out of the car. And everything you just said, every word about the bunker, the procurement records, the names, the diverted equipment, the men who did, the part where you offered to pay me or erase me, all of it went out live, real time. The second you opened your mouth, Mr. Caldwell, it landed in three places at once. A team of federal investigators who've been waiting their whole careers for exactly this. A journalist who's been sitting on this story for 15 years, waiting for the one piece that makes it undeniable. And an automated archive that's already gone out and that no power on this earth, including mine, can call back. She let that settle. You didn't come up here to take control of a situation. You came up here to confess on tape to a federal task force. You've been doing it for the last 10 minutes. You just didn't know who you were talking to. The blood drained from Richard Caldwell's face. "You're lying," he said, but his voice had cracked just slightly, and everyone on the porch heard it. "My people swept this mountain. They swept every inch of it. There's no one here. There's no signal getting off this rock that we don't control. You're bluffing." "Your people swept for what your money taught them to look for," Charlie said. "They're very good. They found everything a normal person would hide." She nodded toward the tree line. "They just didn't find my people, because my people don't hide the way money expects them to hide." And out of the tree line in positions, Caldwell's 6-hour sweep had walked past twice. Harper's federal contacts rose up, weapons leveled, and behind Caldwell's vehicles, two more appeared where there had been nothing. And from the high ground above the cabin, a single red dot settled on the chest of the man standing nearest to Caldwell, and Lucas Grant's cheerful voice called out across the yard from somewhere no one could quite place. "I wouldn't, fellas," Lucas said. "I really, really wouldn't. I've got presents all over this mountain, and I've been bored for 2 days." Caldwell's men froze. They were professionals. They understood instantly and completely that they had walked into a position from which there was no shooting their way out. They were surrounded by people they'd never seen on ground they didn't know, with federal weapons trained on them, and an unknown number of explosives somewhere beneath their feet. One by one, slowly they raised their hands, and Richard Caldwell sat in the chair on Charlie Hayes's porch and watched 30 years of careful insulation, 3 generations of buried fortunes, an entire lifetime of being the most dangerous man in every room come apart around him in the space of 10 seconds. "It's not possible," he said quietly. He was not talking to anyone. "I sweep every room. I've swept every room for 30 years. It's not possible." "It's possible," Charlie said, "because you made the one mistake men like you always make eventually. You couldn't stand not knowing. You'd beaten everyone you'd ever faced, and then you couldn't beat me, and it ate at you, and your pride dragged you up a mountain to look me in the eye and feel like the most dangerous man in the room one more time." She crouched down in front of his chair so they were eye to eye, and her voice was very soft. "I've spent my whole life hunting men like you, Mr. Caldwell. And the thing I learned, the thing that finally let me catch one, is that you're all so certain you can't lose that you'll walk straight into the only thing that beats you. You don't fear death. I knew that. So I didn't threaten your life. I threatened your control, and you came running up this mountain to take it back." She straightened. "There was never a number. There was never going to be a deal. There was only ever this. You on tape in front of a sheriff telling the truth for the first time in your life because you couldn't imagine anyone in the world was smart enough to be listening." Sheriff Carter stepped forward with his cuffs. "Richard Caldwell," he said, and there was 26 years of waiting in his voice, "you have the right to remain silent. And son, this time I really do suggest you take it." The federal agents came out of the trees. Harper walked up the steps slowly, the old colonel, and he looked down at the man in the chair. And then he looked at Charlie, and on his weathered face was an expression she'd never expected to see there. 15 years ago, Harper said quietly, "I stood in a room and told a group of officers that women didn't belong in special operations, that they didn't have what it took. I said it because I was a fool, and because being a fool was comfortable, and because I'd never once met someone who proved me wrong in a way I couldn't argue with." He looked at Caldwell being lifted from the chair, at the agents pouring across the yard, at the whole impossible thing Charlie Hayes had built out of nothing but patience and grief and refusal. "I just watched a woman take apart the most dangerous man in this country with a folding chair and a tape recorder because she understood his pride better than he understood it himself." He turned to her, and the old Marine straightened, and he did something Charlie had never seen him do for anyone. He came to attention and he saluted her. I was wrong, Hayes, about you. About all of it. True leadership never had a thing to do with gender. It only ever had to do with this. He gestured at the mountain, at the trap she'd built, at the truth surfacing all around them. Competence. And the courage to let good people stand beside you. I'm sorry it took me 15 years to learn it. I'm honored I got to learn it from you. Charlie returned the salute because some things you don't refuse, and then she put her hand out instead, and the old colonel took it, and they shook hands like equals, which was all either of them had ever needed to be. It took the rest of the day to bring it all out. The federal team went into the bunker, and what they found down there in the sealed Cold War dark was worse than even Charlie had known. 50 years of it, 3 generations of stolen fortunes documented in the careful handwriting of men who'd been certain it would never see daylight. The names began going out that same night to the journalists, to the task force, to a country that had never imagined how deep the rot ran beneath its own defense. By morning, the story had broken, and by the morning after that, it was the only story anyone was talking about. And the careful machine that Richard Caldwell had spent 30 years building came apart layer by layer by layer, exactly the way he built it. He never did walk. That was the thing. His lawyers couldn't fix the thing. All the money in the world couldn't argue into a fog. There was no shell company to hide behind, no contractor to take the fall, no number with enough zeros to make it disappear. There was only Richard Caldwell on tape on a mountain, confessing to a sheriff because his pride couldn't imagine being outmaneuvered by a woman he had already beaten in his own mind. It was, his lawyers agreed, the most thorough self-destruction any of them had ever witnessed. He'd done it to himself with his own mouth in under 10 minutes. And the men whose names came out of that bunker, the contractors and the intelligence men, and the politicians and the executives, 3 generations of them found over the following months that the hole they'd buried the truth in had become the place the truth came roaring out of, and there was no putting it back. For the first time in 50 years, the people responsible began to answer for it. Charlie stood on her porch a week later in the early morning with a cup of coffee that was for once still warm and watched the sun come up over the Idaho ridges. The mountain was quiet again. The federal teams had gone. The bunker was empty now, its 50 years of secrets carried off into evidence rooms and courtrooms and front pages. There was nothing left up here to guard. Ryan came and stood beside her. He'd stayed the way they'd all stayed through the long days of statements and investigators and the slow, careful work of making sure none of it could ever be buried again. You could leave now, he said. There's nothing here to protect anymore. You won. You could go anywhere, do anything. Charlie thought about that. She looked out at the mountain that powerful men had believed could bury the truth. The mountain that had instead become the place where the truth finally surfaced. The mountain that had never once belonged to the criminals who came to take it. I'm going to stay, she said. I'm going to grow those tomatoes I came up here to grow. I'm going to watch some sunsets. I'm going to learn what it's like to live somewhere that isn't a battlefield. She took a sip of coffee. But I'm not going to do it alone. That was the lesson, Ryan. That was the whole lesson, and it took me 8 years in a mountain to learn it. I spent so long believing that carrying everything by myself was strength, that asking for help was failure, that trust was just a slower way of getting hurt. She turned to look at him, at the man who'd answered the phone after 6 years of silence and asked only where he was needed. It wasn't strength. It was just being alone and calling it something noble so it wouldn't hurt as much. Real strength is the part I almost never got to. It's letting the people you trust stand beside you when the thing you're carrying gets bigger than one person can hold. Down in the yard, Lucas was arguing cheerfully with Noah about something, and Harper was laughing, actually laughing, and Sheriff Carter was leaning against his county truck with the easy posture of a man who had finally, after 26 years, gotten to be the part of the law that mattered. They had all stayed, for a few more days at least. And some of them Charlie suspected would keep coming back the way people do when they've stood beside each other in the place where it counted. The realtor told me this mountain had no history, Charlie said quietly, watching them. Empty range, nobody ever lived here. That's why it was cheap. She smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind she hadn't had in her in years. Turns out it had more history than the whole country, and now it's got a new one. The place where the truth came back up out of the ground, and the people who made it happen found out they didn't have to do it alone. The sun cleared the ridge line and the light came pouring down the slope across the yard, across the people gathered there, across the woman who had once been dismissed as a quiet veteran, hiding from the world, and had instead become the single person who changed the course of a national reckoning. The criminals had believed the mountain was theirs for the taking. They had been catastrophically wrong. The mountain had never belonged to them, and it never would. It belonged the way the truth itself belongs to the person willing to protect it at any cost, and to the people brave enough to stand beside her when the cost came due. Charlie Hayes finished her coffee, set down the cup, and walked down the steps to join her people in the morning light. She had carried the weight alone for long enough. She would never have to carry it alone again. And that in the end was the only victory that had ever mattered. The trial took 14 months, and Charlie Hayes attended every single day of it. She hadn't planned to. After the federal teams cleared the mountain and the names started going out, she'd told herself she was done, that she'd given enough, that she could finally let the system carry the weight. It had refused to carry the first time. But on the morning the first proceedings began, she found herself in a borrowed suit sitting in a courtroom in Boise, watching Richard Caldwell walk in, wearing a suit that cost more than her truck. And she understood that she had to be there. Not to gloat, she had never once felt the urge to gloat. She had to be there because 8 years ago she'd attended funerals for men who died because of a number on a page, and nobody had ever sat in a courtroom and answered for it. This time someone would, and she was going to watch. Ryan came with her on the first day. Understudy. He sat beside her in the gallery in his own borrowed suit, looking deeply uncomfortable, the way big men always look in places where they can't move. And when Caldwell was led to the defense table, Ryan leaned over and said quietly, "He looks smaller than he did on the mountain." "They always do," Charlie said, "once the room stops belonging to them." And the room did not belong to Richard Caldwell anymore. That was the thing Charlie noticed first, the thing that struck her in the chest harder than she'd expected. For 30 years, this man had walked into every room and owned it, bent it to his will, made everyone in it smaller just by being there. But a courtroom belongs to the law, and the law had finally caught up with him, and you could see it in the way he sat, in the small movements of his hands, in the way his eyes kept going to the door, as if some part of him still believed a phone call was coming that would make this all go away. No phone call came. Charlie had made certain of that. The tape was played on the third day. The prosecutor stood up and told the jury they were about to hear the defendant in his own voice on the mountain, and then she pressed a button, and Richard Caldwell's smooth, confident voice filled the courtroom, talking about the bunker, about the procurement records, about 3 generations of stolen fortunes, about casualties being a part of every enterprise. Charlie watched the jury's faces while it played. She watched them go from neutral to disturbed to something colder and harder, and she watched Caldwell himself sit at the defense table with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, listening to the most damning words ever spoken in an American courtroom, and all of them his own. When the tape reached the part where he offered to pay her or erase her, a woman in the second row of the jury box put her hand over her mouth. That was the moment Charlie knew. That single small gesture. That was the moment the verdict was decided 14 months before it would be read. Sheriff Daniel Carter testified for 2 full days. He was magnificent. 26 years of writing tickets and pulling drunks out of ditches, had it turned out, prepared him perfectly for this, because there was nothing the defense could throw at him that rattled the calm certainty of a man who had finally, at the end of his career, gotten to be the part of the law that mattered. They tried to make him look like a small-town fool and over his head. He looked at the lawyer doing it and said in his slow, steady drawl, "Son, I've been the law in my county for 26 years. I know exactly what I heard. I know exactly what I saw, and I know exactly what I'm doing here. The only one in this room who seems confused about any of that is you." The gallery laughed. The judge didn't gavel it down right away, which told Charlie which way the wind was blowing in that room too. Harper testified about the federal coordination, about the careful chain of custody, about how the recordings had reached 3 separate locations the instant they were made. The defense tried to suggest the whole thing was an illegal trap, an entrapment, a violation of Caldwell's rights. Harper, the old Marine, looked at them the way he might look at a private who'd shown up to formation with his boots untied. "Entrapment," Harper said, "is when you convince a man to commit a crime he wouldn't otherwise commit." Nobody convinced Richard Caldwell of anything. He came up that mountain of his own free will, swept it with his own people, sat down in a chair, and confessed to 30 years of crimes because he could not conceive of a world in which a woman had outthought him. That's not entrapment, counselor. That's pride. And the last time I checked, pride still isn't a defense in an American court. The journalist, a woman Charlie had trusted for 15 years, had broken the story in 3 parts over the course of a week, and by the time the trial began, the whole country knew the shape of it. The bunker, the 50 years of buried records, the 3 generations of men who turned the nation's defense into a private bank account and buried the proof in a hole in the Idaho mountains. The story was bigger than Caldwell now. His arrest had been the thread, and the country had spent 14 months pulling on it, and the whole rotten tapestry had come apart. Contractors indicted. Intelligence officials forced to testify before Congress. Politicians who'd taken the money discovering that the money came with a paper trail none of them had known existed because the man who'd kept the paper trail had never imagined it would surface. Charlie watched it all with a strange, quiet feeling she took a long time to identify. It wasn't triumph. She told Lucas once that she'd killed too many men to ever feel triumph, and that was still true. It wasn't even satisfaction exactly. It was something closer to peace, the kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from finally, after years, setting down a weight you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. The men she'd buried 8 years ago, the funerals she'd attended in silence, the evidence she'd taken up the chain and watched disappear. For 8 years, she'd carried the knowledge that the system didn't work, that the powerful didn't answer, that trust was just a slower way of being betrayed. And now, sitting in a courtroom in Boise, she watched the system work. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but it worked because this time she hadn't trusted it to work on its own. This time she'd built something it couldn't ignore. That was the lesson. It had taken her 8 years in a mountain to learn it. The system didn't fail because it was the system. It failed when good people handed it the truth and walked away trusting it to do the right thing on its own. The truth needed people willing to stand behind it, people willing to make it undeniable, people willing to stay in the room. So she stayed in the room. 14 months of it. The verdict came down on a gray morning in late autumn. The jury was out for less than a day, which everyone said was extraordinary for a case that complex. And when they filed back in, Charlie was sitting in her usual seat in the gallery, and Ryan was beside her, and Harper was on her other side. And Sheriff Carter had driven all the way down from his county to be there. And Lucas and Noah were 2 rows back because they had all in their own way never quite finished standing beside her. The foreman stood up. It was the woman from the second row, the one who'd put her hand over her mouth when the tape played. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, she read, "We find the defendant guilty." Charlie did not move. On the charge of solicitation of murder, we find the defendant guilty. She felt Ryan's hand close over hers. The foreman kept writing. The list was long. It took a while. Guilty and guilty and guilty, count after count after count, 30 years of crimes finally given their names, and with each one, Charlie felt something in her chest that she'd carried for 8 years grow a little lighter, a little looser, until by the end of it, she could breathe in a way she hadn't been able to breathe since before the funerals. Richard Caldwell did not react. He sat at the defense table and stared at the middle distance and did not move, and Charlie understood that for a man like him, this was the death he'd never feared made real. Not the end of his life, the end of his control, the end of being the most dangerous man in every room. He would spend the rest of his years in a place where he owned nothing and controlled no one, and for Richard Caldwell, that was worse than any bullet. When it was done, when the judge had thanked the jury and the bailiffs had come to take Caldwell away, the small, smooth man paused as they led him past the gallery, and he looked at Charlie, really looked at her for the first time since the mountain. "How," he said, "it was barely a word. 30 years. How did you know I'd come?" And Charlie, who had hunted men like him her whole life, who had finally caught one, looked back at him with no anger and no triumph, only a kind of weary clarity. "Because you couldn't imagine losing," she said quietly. "And a man who can't imagine losing has already lost. He just doesn't know it yet." They led him away. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse on the steps, the others were waiting for her, and so were the cameras. And so was the journalist, and so was a crowd that had gathered to see the woman who'd done what nobody thought could be done. Charlie stopped at the top of the steps and looked at all of it, and for a moment she wanted to turn around and go out the back and disappear the way she'd disappeared up a mountain 8 months before all this began. But she didn't, Because disappearing was the old lesson, the wrong one, the loneliness that called itself strength. So she walked down the steps to where her people were waiting, and she let the cameras see her. And when the journalist asked her if she had anything to say, she thought about it for a moment, and then she said the only thing that mattered. For 50 years, Charlie said, powerful men believed that if you buried the truth deep enough in a hole far enough from anyone who'd care, it would stay buried. They were wrong. The truth doesn't rot. It waits. And eventually it finds someone willing to dig it up and carry it into the light no matter what it costs. She looked at the men beside her. I didn't do this alone. I want that to be very clear. I spent 8 months thinking I had to, and I was wrong about that too. The only reason any of this happened is that good people decided to stand beside each other when it counted. That's the whole story. That's the only story there ever is. And then she walked away from the cameras with her people around her, and she went home to her mountain. The years that followed were quieter than any Charlie Hayes had known. She grew the tomatoes. It turned out she was bad at it the first year and lost most of the crop to a late frost she should have seen coming, and Ryan, who came up most months, laughed at her so hard he had to sit down. 30 years a sniper, he said, wiping his eyes. You can put a round through a man's eye at 1,500 yards, and you can't keep a tomato alive. The second year she did better. The third year she had more tomatoes than any reasonable person could eat, and she gave them away to the whole county, dropping baskets on porches, and the people of the valley, who had once been wary of the mysterious woman on the mountain, came to know her as the lady with the impossible garden and the terrible coffee. The mountain changed. The bunker was sealed for good, its records gone, its secret finally surrendered. The federal government, in a rare fit of decency, paid to repair the damage the land thieves had done all those years ago, replaced the poison stream's ecosystem, restored the fences, and quietly granted Charlie clear title to land that no one would ever again pretend was abandoned. The deer came back, the water ran clean, and the mountain that powerful men had believed could bury the truth became instead just a mountain, again a beautiful one, where a tired woman finally learned how to live. They came back, all of them. That was the part Charlie had never expected. Ryan came most often, and after the second year, he stopped pretending it was to check on her and admitted he just liked the quiet, liked the mountain, liked sitting on the porch with a woman who'd known him before the war, broke them both, and didn't need him to explain a single thing. He set up a small clinic in the valley, the nearest one for 40 miles, and the people of the county came to depend on the combat medic who'd patched up men under fire and now patched up farmers and children and old men with bad hearts, and who hummed old country songs while he worked the same way he always had. Lucas came twice a year, loud and grinning, and every single time he tried to convince Charlie to let him blow something up, just one thing, just a stump, just for old time's sake, and every single time she said no, and every single time he sulked about it for exactly as long as it took to open the first beer. He'd found work he could believe in, clearing old munitions from places where wars had ended, but the danger hadn't making safe the ground that other men had made deadly, and it suited him because Lucas Grant had only ever wanted to use what he knew to keep people alive instead of the other way around. Noah came without warning, the way he always had, appearing on the porch when no one had heard a vehicle, sitting quietly for a few days and then gone again just as silently. He never said much. He never needed to. He'd spent his whole career being invisible, and he'd finally found a place where being invisible felt like peace instead of loneliness. And that place was a mountain in Idaho where a woman he'd helped save understood that the quiet ones needed somewhere to be quiet too. Sheriff Carter retired the year after the trial, 27 years on the job, and the county threw him a party that half the valley attended. And when they asked him to say a few words, he told the story of the one case that mattered, the woman on the mountain, and the most dangerous man in the country, and the folding chair, and the tape recorder, and he told it so well that grown men cried. He came up to the mountain after that more than he'd ever come up before, and he and Charlie would sit on the porch and not talk much, two people who'd done the thing that mattered and didn't need to keep talking about it, and that was its own kind of friendship, the best kind. The kind that doesn't need words to fill the silence. And Harper, old Colonel Harper, who'd stood in a room 15 years ago and said a woman didn't belong, who'd driven up the mountain in the dark to say he'd been wrong, who'd saluted her on a porch with federal agents pouring across the yard. Harper came up the mountain one last time 3 years after the trial, an old man, now slower, grayer, his hands not quite steady, and he sat on Charlie's porch in the morning light. and they drank her terrible coffee and watched the sun come up over the ridges. I've been thinking, Harper said, about what I want to do with the time I've got left, which isn't much, the doctors tell me. Heart's giving out, old engine, lot of miles. He said it the way old soldiers say such things without drama as a simple fact. And I keep coming back to that room. 15 years ago, all those young officers looking at me, taking their cues from me, and me standing up there telling them women couldn't do this work. He shook his head slowly. I poisoned a generation of them with that haze. Some of those young men are colonels now themselves, telling their own people the same lie I told them because I taught them it was true. You can't unsay it, Charlie said gently. I learned that a long time ago. You can't take back the things you taught people when you were wrong. No, Harper agreed, but you can teach them something new. He looked at her. I've been writing. Did you know that old fool with a typewriter? I've been writing down everything. The room, what I said, why I was wrong, and the mountain, what I watched you do. Every bit of it true as I can make it. He paused. I want it taught, Hayes, at the schools, the academies, the places where they make the next generation of officers. I want them to read about the old colonel who was certain women couldn't lead, and the woman who took apart the most dangerous man in the country and proved that leadership was never about anything but competence and courage and the willingness to let good people stand beside you. His old eyes were wet. I can't take back what I taught, but maybe I can teach the opposite loud enough and true enough that it drowns out the lie. Maybe that's what the time I've got left is for. Charlie was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on the old man's arm. They'll read it, she said. I'll make sure of it. Every officer who comes through for as long as there are officers. They'll read what you wrote. She squeezed his arm. That's not a small thing, Colonel. That's not a small thing at all. A man who admits he was wrong loud enough for the next generation to hear it, that's worth more than a man who was never wrong in the first place. Anybody can be right by accident. It takes a real soldier to stand up in front of everyone and say, I was wrong, and here's what I learned, and here's how you do better than I did. Harper nodded, and he didn't trust himself to speak for a moment, and the two of them sat in the morning light and watched the sun clear the ridge. He died that winter peacefully in his sleep. His writings were published, and then they were taught, just as Charlie had promised, at the academies and the schools, and a generation of young officers learned the story of the old colonel and the woman on the mountain, and learned that the only thing that had ever mattered about leadership was competence and courage and trust. Charlie spoke at his funeral. She didn't say much. She'd never been one for speeches, but she said the thing that mattered. He was wrong about me once, she said, standing over the grave of the man who doubted her and then spent the last years of his life making it right. And then he spent 15 years becoming the kind of man who could admit it. I've known a lot of people who were right their whole lives and never grew an inch. William Harper was wrong, and then he grew more than any man I ever met. That's the harder thing. That's the better thing. I was proud to call him my friend. I'm prouder still that he called me his. And then she went home to her mountain. On the 10th anniversary of the day, Mason Briggs cut her fence and poisoned her stream, and believed a woman alone would be easy. Charlie Hayes sat on her porch in the early morning with a cup of coffee that was for once still warm. The garden was heavy with tomatoes. The stream ran clean. The deer moved through the tree line in the gray light unafraid because nothing on this mountain had hunted them in 10 years. Ryan was inside making breakfast because he'd more or less moved up to the valley for good and came up most mornings now, and the smell of it drifted out through the open door. Down at the bottom of the logging trail, she could see the dust of a vehicle climbing, and she knew without looking that it was Lucas, early for the gathering they had every year on this day, loud and grinning, and probably with something he wanted to blow up in the back of his truck. Noah would appear sometime today, silently, the way he always did. Carter would drive up after lunch. They came every year on this day, the people who had stood beside her, to mark the day it all began, and to remember the days that followed. Charlie sipped her coffee and watched the sun come up over the Idaho ridges, and she thought about the woman she'd been 10 years ago, the one who'd come up this mountain to disappear, the one who'd decided it was better to die alone than to ask for help, the one who'd believed that carrying everything by herself was the only kind of strength there was. She'd been so wrong about all of it. The realtor had told her this mountain had no history. Empty range, nobody ever lived here. That was why it was cheap. And it had turned out to have more history than the whole country 50 years of buried truth, and 3 generations of buried crime, and Charlie Hayes had dug it up and carried it into the light at a cost she'd been willing to pay alone. But she hadn't paid it alone. That was the thing she understood now, sitting on her porch in the morning light, with breakfast cooking and her people climbing the mountain to be with her. She hadn't paid it alone because the moment she'd finally found the strength to pick up the phone, she discovered that the weight she'd thought would crush one person was nothing at all when good people carried it together. That was the real history of the mountain now. Not the bunker, not the crimes, not even the trial. The real history was the people who'd climbed it when she asked, and the people who kept climbing it still year after year because they'd stood beside each other in the place where it counted and discovered they never wanted to stop. Ryan came out onto the porch with 2 plates and handed her one and sat down beside her, and down the trail, Lucas's truck pulled into the yard, and the loud grinning man climbed out and called up to the porch. "The ghost lives 10 years and you still make terrible coffee." And Charlie laughed a real laugh, the kind that came easy now. The sun cleared the ridge line and the light came pouring down the slope across the garden, and the clean stream, and the unafraid deer across the people gathering in the yard, across the woman who had once been dismissed as a quiet veteran, hiding from the world, and had become instead the person who proved that the truth always surfaces and that no one ever has to carry it alone. The mountain had never belonged to the criminals who came to take it. It had never belonged to the powerful men who believed they could bury the truth beneath it. It belonged the way the truth itself belongs to the person willing to protect it at any cost. And that person had finally, after a lifetime of carrying everything alone, learned the last and best lesson the mountain had to teach. She set down her coffee and she looked at the people she loved, gathered in the morning light, and Charlie Hayes understood with a certainty deeper than anything she'd ever known, through a rifle scope, that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the people she belonged with, and that she would never ever be alone on her mountain again. The sun rose, the coffee was warm, her people were home, and that in the end was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.